Benjamin Cole stood at the window of his penthouse apartment, watching the city pulse beneath him. The lights of New York City flickered like a million tiny stars, each one a story, a life, a dream. His dream, in a sense, was this skyscraper of glass and steel that towered over the city, a monument to his success. At 35, he had built an empire of tech companies, real estate acquisitions, and investments that had made him a billionaire several times over. He had everything a man could want. Everything except peace. His fingers traced the rim of the whiskey glass in his hand, the amber liquid swirling lazily. The clink of ice was the only sound in the otherwise quiet apartment. Beneath the surface of his success, a gnawing loneliness persisted, one that no amount of money could fill. The opulence that surrounded him, the fine furniture, the art collection worth millions, the private chef who cooked meals for him alone, felt like nothing more than a gilded cage. The soft hum of the city below only reminded him of how detached he had become from it all. The phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. Marcus, his business partner. "We need to talk. Big opportunity. Come by the office at noon." Benjamin let out a quiet sigh, running a hand through his dark hair. Marcus was always about the next big deal, the next million-dollar investment. His world was a carousel of constant transactions, a dizzying blur of money and opportunity. Sometimes Benjamin found himself wondering if Marcus truly cared about anything beyond the next deal. It wasn't that he disliked the man. He was simply different, practical, detached. And yet somehow Benjamin felt obligated to keep up with him, to play the game at the pace Marcus set. He set the glass down on the marble countertop, the cold surface grounding him for a moment. He stared at his reflection in the window, but it was a stranger who stared back. A man who had everything and yet felt like nothing. How had he ended up here, in this towering fortress of glass, so far removed from the person he once wanted to be? His thoughts turned inward again, to the things he'd buried deep inside. The lack of connection with his family, the absence of real friendships, the endless nights spent working, always working, as if somehow that would solve it all. Yet it hadn't. He was about to leave when the sound of his front door opening interrupted his reverie. He turned to see his assistant, Carla, walking in with her usual efficiency. She was dressed in a sleek black dress, carrying a folder in one hand. "Mr. Cole," she began, her voice crisp, "there's a property you may be interested in. It's a historic mansion outside the city. It's been abandoned for years, but it has incredible potential." Benjamin's eyes narrowed, already uninterested. He was used to the endless stream of properties Carla presented, each one seemingly more lucrative than the last. "I'm not in the mood for another renovation project, Carla," he replied, already moving toward the door. She hesitated for a moment, then placed the folder on the desk. "This one's different," she said. "It's on a hill outside a small town. It has history, family ties to the area. The town is dying, but there's talk that this place could bring it back to life. You could turn it into something meaningful." Benjamin paused, the words catching his attention. "Meaningful?" he repeated, his tone skeptical. "The house is in bad shape, but it could be something special. It's been on the market for a while, and the owner's just looking to get rid of it. But there's a catch." He raised an eyebrow. "What kind of catch?" "There's someone living there." A frown tugged at the corner of his mouth. "A squatter?" he asked, disinterested. Carla shook her head. "Not exactly. The house has a caretaker, a woman, apparently. She's been living there for the past few months. I don't know the full details, but there's a lot of personal history tied to the place." Benjamin's curiosity piqued despite himself. "Send me the details," he said, already thinking ahead. A renovation like that would be expensive, but he could easily turn it into a profitable project. If it was truly as meaningful as Carla claimed, maybe it was worth a look. She nodded and left, but the idea of this house, this woman living there, lingered in his mind. What kind of person would choose to live in a dilapidated mansion in the middle of nowhere? The thought seemed absurd, and yet there was something about it that gnawed at him, something that made him wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was more to this than a simple property deal. The following morning, Benjamin drove out to the small town, leaving the city's buzz behind. The drive was long, the quiet countryside unfamiliar, the towering skyscrapers shrinking in his rearview mirror until they were mere specks. The mansion sat at the top of a hill, shrouded by trees that had begun to lose their summer green. The weathered stone of the house seemed to echo the decay around it, rusted gates, broken windows, the smell of old wood and dust heavy in the air. He stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching beneath his polished shoes. His gaze swept over the house. He could already see the potential. The bones of the building were solid, a relic of the past, perhaps with more history than he could fully comprehend. But it wasn't the house that drew him in now. It was the thought of the woman inside, the one who lived here amidst the decay. His eyes traveled to the windows, half covered with ivy. He wondered what kind of person would choose to stay in a place like this, so far removed from the world, so filled with memories of better days. A question lingered in his mind, a whisper of curiosity. What if, just maybe, there was more to life than deals and profits? What if, just maybe, she could show him what he'd been missing all along? With a final glance at the crumbling house, he took a step forward, his fate, like the mansion, teetering on the edge of something unexpected. The mansion loomed ahead, its broken windows like hollow eyes, watching Benjamin as he approached. The quiet of the countryside felt different now, somehow unsettling. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and damp earth, the kind of smell that clung to your clothes long after you left. It was a place suspended in time, caught between a past it couldn't escape and a future it couldn't quite claim. Benjamin stood still for a moment, taking it all in, the grandeur and the decay, the beauty and the ruin. His fingers brushed against the cold iron gate, and for the briefest moment he considered walking away. Maybe the house wasn't the opportunity he thought it was. Maybe there was too much history here, too much baggage that he wasn't prepared to deal with. But something held him in place. He didn't know what it was, but it was enough to propel him forward. He pushed the gate open with a creak, the sound echoing in the silence. As he approached the steps leading up to the front door, he saw it, a figure in the window, a woman. She was standing there watching him. Her face was partially obscured by the drapes, but he could see the outline of her, a slight, elegant form, the faintest glimmer of curiosity in her posture. His heart skipped a beat, though he couldn't quite explain why. It wasn't like him to be drawn to someone so remote. Yet something in her stillness, her calm, made him feel as if he were intruding on something very private. As he reached the door, a woman's voice called out from within, startling him. "Can I help you?" Benjamin hesitated, his hand hovering over the ornate brass door knocker. I'm here about the house," he said, his voice sounding rougher than he intended. The door creaked open slowly, and there she stood, a woman in her late 20s, her hair falling in soft waves around her shoulders. Her eyes, a piercing blue that seemed to see right through him, regarded him with a guarded wariness. She was dressed simply, a loose sweater and jeans, the kind of clothes that looked effortlessly comfortable and yet well worn, as if they had been chosen for the long hours of labor she must have spent restoring this old house. She was beautiful, but there was something more to her than her looks, something that made Benjamin pause, Beneath the surface of her cool exterior, he saw a flicker of something else. Fear, maybe, or caution. He couldn't tell. "I'm Benjamin Cole," he said, offering his hand. "I understand this house is for sale." She didn't take his hand right away. Instead, she studied him for a long moment, her gaze flicking to the sleek, expensive car parked at the bottom of the driveway before returning to him. "You're a businessman, then?" Her voice was soft, but laced with something sharper. A challenge, perhaps. "I guess you could say that," he replied, trying to sound casual, though he was already beginning to sense the tension in the air. "I specialize in real estate, renovations mostly, and I'd like to see about restoring this place." Her eyes narrowed ever so slightly. Restoring it for what? Profit? Benjamin felt the sharpness of her words, the subtle accusation in her tone. He understood it in a way. She probably didn't trust men like him, men who came in, made grand promises, and left with their hands full of money while the heart of the place remained untouched. He hesitated, searching for the right words. "Not just for profit," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I believe this house could be something more. It's not just about money for me. I want to restore its history, give it the respect it deserves." She looked at him as if she were assessing his sincerity, as if deciding whether to let him in or whether to send him on his way. "I'm Eleanor Parker," she said, her voice softening just slightly, "but everyone calls me Ellie. And as much as I appreciate your offer, I don't think you understand what this place means. It's not a project, it's family, legacy." Her words hung in the air between them, as heavy as the dust settling on the furniture in the grand entryway. Benjamin found himself looking around, taking in the faded grandeur of the space. The chandelier above was covered in dust, its once sparkling crystal now dull. The walls were lined with old portraits, their frames chipped and cracked, but the faces within them were still proud, untouched by time. Ellie stepped back, her posture shifting slightly, as if to invite him in, or maybe to keep him at arm's length. "You'll have to forgive the state of things. I'm not exactly equipped for entertaining." Benjamin stepped into the hallway, his shoes echoing against the wooden floors. "It's fine. I understand." He wasn't sure what made him follow her inside. Maybe it was the way she spoke, with that blend of pride and defensiveness, or the way she moved through the space, as though she were a part of it, not just a person passing through. She was tied to this place in a way that was beyond her control, beyond what he could see at first glance. "This house has been in my family for generations," Ellie continued, walking slowly down the hall. "It's all I have left, and I'm not willing to let it go to someone who sees it as just another investment." Benjamin listened, drawn in by the rawness in her voice. He could hear the weight of history in her words, the attachment, the love, and perhaps even the pain that came with holding on to something so precious. It wasn't just a house to her, it was home. It was her mother's, her grandmother's, and now it was hers. "I'm not here to disrespect that," he said softly, realizing as he spoke that he meant it. "I just want to see it restored, if you'll let me." She paused, turning to look at him, the light from the window catching her features in a soft glow. There was something vulnerable in her eyes, something he hadn't noticed before. Her wariness was still there, but now it was joined by a quiet curiosity. Benjamin felt the pull of something deeper between them, an unspoken understanding, or perhaps a shared need. For a moment it was as though the whole world had fallen away. It was just him and Ellie, standing in the faded elegance of this house, each of them holding on to something they feared would slip through their fingers if they weren't careful. And then, almost as if she had made a decision in that brief silence, she spoke again, her voice more measured. If you want to restore it, then you'll have to do it on my terms. This house isn't for sale, not to the highest bidder. It's for the right person, someone who understands what it means to preserve it, not just profit from it." Benjamin nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I think I can do that." Benjamin sat on the worn leather chair by the fireplace, watching the fire flicker in front of him. The crackling sound was a strange comfort, something raw and real, like everything here, everything about the house. It was so different from the sleek, polished environments he was used to, where everything was clean, controlled, and expected. There were no bright lights or spotless marble here. The edges were rough, the surfaces scarred with time, yet there was a warmth, an authenticity that seemed to beckon him closer. Ellie had left him alone in the sitting room, but he could feel her presence even now, her eyes, the quiet tension in her voice. She was a woman who guarded her heart like she guarded the house, fiercely, protectively, as if it could all slip away if she didn't keep a constant vigil. And yet, despite the walls she had put up, Benjamin saw something more, something softer, something that both intrigued and terrified him. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. There was more to this place than just wood and stone. He could feel it in his bones, the weight of history, the echoes of lives lived in every corner of the house. It was a place where memories had been made, and where pain and love had coexisted for generations. Benjamin's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching from the hall. He straightened, instinctively preparing himself for the next conversation, the next hurdle. It had been nearly an hour since Ellie had left to take care of something upstairs. Her absence had allowed him a rare moment of peace to think, but he was quickly reminded that the real work, the real challenge, wasn't going to be about restoring the house. It would be about understanding Ellie, about navigating the labyrinth of her past and present. She stepped into the room, her presence commanding and calm, but something was different in the way she held herself now. The walls she'd built earlier had softened, if only slightly. There was a vulnerability in her eyes, a quiet openness that made Benjamin's heart tighten in a way he hadn't expected. She was no longer the wary stranger. She was someone who had allowed him a glimpse into her world, however guardedly. "Leo's asleep," Ellie said, her voice low, almost as if she were speaking in a language meant only for them. "He's a good sleeper. Always has been." Benjamin nodded, his gaze following her as she moved to a small table by the window and set down a tray of tea. The simple act of making tea felt like an intimate gesture, a way of sharing something that didn't require words. He could tell by the way she moved, her grace, that she was accustomed to working alone, to carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders without complaint. There was a quiet strength in her that made him wonder how she had survived all these years in this house. Alone, with a child, and no real support system to lean on. Ellie. He hesitated, unsure of how to continue. He didn't want to push her, but there was something inside him that needed to ask. "How did you end up here? In this house?" She paused, her fingers lingering on the handle of the teapot, before she finally turned to face him. Her eyes were deep, filled with stories she hadn't shared, but Benjamin sensed they were stories she needed to tell. "I left everything behind," she said quietly. "I had to. My ex, he wasn't a good man. He thought he owned me, thought he could control everything I did. But when I got pregnant with Leo, that was when I realized I couldn't stay. I had to protect him. I had to make sure Leo had a better life than I did. So, I came here. To this house." Benjamin felt a pang of sorrow as he listened to her words. He could hear the weight of the pain in her voice, the years of struggle she had endured, and he couldn't help but feel a fierce protectiveness stir within him. No one should have to carry that kind of burden alone, not when there were people in the world who could help. "You've done a remarkable job," Benjamin said, his voice quiet but sincere. "This house, it's been neglected, but you've made it your own. You've given it life again." Ellie looked down at the tray of tea, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of the table. "It's not much. It's just me and Leo here, but it's ours. No one can take that away." The passion in her words struck him. There was no pretension in her, no yearning for recognition. She wasn't interested in what others thought of her or her home. It was about her, about them, and that was all that mattered. He could respect that. He could understand it in a way, because it was something he lacked. For all his wealth, for all his accomplishments, he had never felt ownership over anything so deeply. His life had been one of constant movement, a series of acquisitions and sales, with no real roots to hold him down. "Why this house?" Benjamin asked, his voice soft. "Why not sell it? Start fresh somewhere else?" She met his gaze then, and in her eyes was a mixture of sadness and something else, something softer. "This house has been in my family for generations. My grandmother, my great-grandmother, they all lived here. It's not just bricks and mortar. It's history. It's the only thing I have left of them, and I'm not going to let it go. Not for anyone." Benjamin felt the truth of her words settle deep in his chest. He had never truly understood what it meant to hold on to something. Not like this, not with this kind of emotional investment. He was used to letting things go when they no longer served a purpose, replacing them with the next thing, the next project. But Ellie's commitment to this house, to her family's legacy, made him question everything he thought he knew about attachment, about belonging. "I'm not here to take it from you," he said, his voice steady, as though making a promise. "I'm here to help you restore it, not for me, but for you, for Leo, to honor what this place means." She seemed to consider his words for a long moment, and Benjamin could see the internal struggle playing out on her face. Her eyes flicked to the stairs, where Leo was sleeping upstairs, before returning to him. Finally, she nodded slowly, though it was clear she still harbored doubts. "Maybe you'll understand," she murmured, "when you're here longer, when you see what it really means to keep something alive." Benjamin didn't respond. Instead, he sat back, watching her with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. He didn't know where this path would lead, but for the first time in a long while, he felt something stirring inside him. A pull, a desire to understand, to connect. And somehow he knew that in this house, this old crumbling mansion, he might just find the answers he had been searching for, whether he was ready for them or not. Benjamin left the mansion that evening with more questions than answers. The words Ellie had spoken echoed in his mind as he drove back to the city, the lights of the small town fading in his rearview mirror. She had spoken of legacy, of family history, of a place that was more than just bricks and mortar. And yet, beneath her words, there was something else, something deeper, a kind of pain she hadn't fully revealed, a truth she hadn't yet let him see. He couldn't help but feel drawn to her. There was a quiet strength in Ellie, a resilience that matched the weathered beauty of the house she called home. But there was also something fragile in her, something that made Benjamin want to protect her, not just from the world, but from herself, from the weight of the past she was carrying alone. And Leo, her son, he'd barely seen the child, just a glimpse of him through the door when Ellie had come downstairs. But the way Ellie spoke about him, the way her whole demeanor softened at the mention of his name, told Benjamin everything he needed to know. Leo wasn't just her child, he was her reason, her anchor, and in a way that made Ellie even more of a mystery to him. She had been through so much, yet she still carried on, still fought for a future for her son, for her family. She had rebuilt a life from the ashes of a broken past, and Benjamin couldn't help but wonder if she had somehow built walls around her heart to protect herself from ever feeling that kind of pain again. As he parked his car outside his penthouse, Benjamin realized that he hadn't even thought about the house all evening. It wasn't the renovation he was thinking about anymore. It wasn't the property deal or the investment. It was her, Ellie, and he had no idea what to do with that feeling. The next few days passed in a blur of meetings, calls, and business as usual. Yet in the back of his mind, the mansion and Ellie lingered. He found himself driving back to the town again without any real reason, just to see the place, to stand before the house that seemed to call to him. He told himself it was just business, that he was still considering the project. But deep down he knew better. It was Ellie he was thinking about. It was Ellie whose face he saw in his mind whenever he closed his eyes, her soft smile, the way she had looked at him when she spoke of Leo, of the house, of her past. When he arrived this time, the sky was overcast, the air heavy with the promise of rain. The mansion stood before him, a little more alive than before, its towering structure no longer just a crumbling relic. It felt like a place with a story, a place that had endured, much like Ellie herself. He stepped out of the car and made his way up the path again, his boots crunching on the gravel. The door was slightly ajar when he reached it, as though inviting him in. Benjamin hesitated for just a moment before pushing it open and stepping inside. The smell of wood and dust greeted him, the familiar scent of a house that had been left alone for too long. Ellie was in the sitting room again, sitting by the fire, her back to him as she gazed into the flames. She didn't hear him at first, and Benjamin stood there for a moment, watching her. There was a grace to her, even in stillness. Her dark hair, loose around her shoulders, caught the light from the fire, casting soft shadows across her face. When she finally turned, her expression softened, though there was still that wariness in her eyes. "I didn't expect you back so soon," she said, her voice steady but laced with something he couldn't quite place. "I couldn't stay away," he said before he even realized the words had left his mouth. He hadn't meant to say that, hadn't intended to let the truth slip out. But there it was. And when he saw the surprise flicker in her eyes, he realized it didn't sound as casual as he'd hoped. Ellie raised an eyebrow, but there was a smile tugging at her lips, despite the guardedness still holding her back. "You're not here for the house this time, are you?" Benjamin's gaze softened as he stepped further into the room. "No," he said, his voice quieter now. "I'm not here for the house. Not just for the house." The air between them shifted, as though the words hung suspended, neither one willing to break the moment, neither one knowing exactly how to move forward. Ellie stood slowly, folding her arms across her chest. "I don't want to waste your time," she said, her voice dropping a bit, as though she were talking more to herself than to him. "I'm not sure I'm ready to trust someone with this place, with what it means." Benjamin took a step closer, the distance between them feeling suddenly very small. He didn't want to push her, but he also didn't want to let this moment pass without saying what he needed to say. "You don't have to trust me with it all at once, Ellie," he said softly. "I'm not asking you to give me everything. I just want to help. I want to do this with you. Not for you." She looked away then, her gaze dropping to the floor as if she were processing his words. There was a tightness in her jaw, a silent battle behind her eyes that Benjamin couldn't quite decipher. But he could see the vulnerability creeping through, the hesitation, the uncertainty that made her more human, more relatable, and more beautiful than any mask of strength she could put on. After a long pause, she finally spoke, her voice softer now. "I don't know if I can trust anyone again," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "After everything that's happened, it's hard to let people in." Benjamin stepped closer, closer than he had before. "I don't want to hurt you, Ellie," he said, his voice rough with an honesty he hadn't intended to show. I don't want you to carry all of this alone." The words hung between them, and for a moment neither of them moved. It was as though the weight of their shared silence spoke louder than anything either of them could say. Finally, Ellie exhaled, a soft, almost imperceptible sigh that made Benjamin's chest tighten. "I don't know if I can trust anyone, Benjamin. Not yet. But maybe we can start with the house. We can start with that." Benjamin smiled, the tightness in his chest easing. He nodded slowly, understanding the quiet invitation in her words. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was a beginning. "Let's start with that," he agreed. And for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was more to this than either of them had realized. Benjamin sat in the quiet stillness of the mansion, the sound of the wind outside tapping gently at the windows. Ellie had retreated upstairs to check on Leo, leaving him alone in the sitting room, where the fire was slowly dying down. Despite the warmth of the flames, he felt a chill in his bones that wasn't easily explained. Perhaps it was the weight of the unspoken words between him and Ellie, or the fact that he had come to this house expecting one thing, business, and had left with something far more complicated, an undeniable connection to the woman standing at its heart. The reality of the situation was beginning to settle in. It wasn't just about restoring a house. It wasn't just about preserving a piece of history. For the first time in years, Benjamin realized he was actually invested, emotionally invested. And it wasn't in the property. It was in Ellie, in her story, in the vulnerability she'd shown him, even if she didn't yet fully trust him. His thoughts were interrupted when Ellie returned, carrying Leo in her arms, her face softened by a maternal warmth that Benjamin had only caught glimpses of before. Leo, a small, wide-eyed child with dark hair and a curious gaze, looked up at Benjamin as Ellie gently lowered him onto the couch beside her. His tiny hands grabbed at the fabric of her sweater, and she smiled down at him, her expression transforming into something infinitely tender. Benjamin watched them, a knot forming in his chest. The love Ellie had for her son was palpable, woven into every movement, every glance she gave him. Leo was her world, and from the way she looked at him, it was clear that her world had been built entirely around him. For a moment, the silence between them felt comfortable, almost peaceful. Benjamin wasn't sure how long he'd been sitting there, lost in thought, when Ellie finally spoke. "Leo's been asking about you," she said, her voice soft but carrying a note of curiosity. "He's not used to strangers, but he thinks you're different." Benjamin chuckled quietly, trying to mask the tenderness that was quickly swelling in his chest. "I don't know about that," he replied, looking down at Leo, who was now playing with a small wooden toy in his lap. "But I'd like to think I'm not so scary." Ellie smiled, but it was a bittersweet smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "He's been through a lot. So have I. And we've learned to trust only a few people. I can't say I've trusted anyone outside my little bubble in a long time." Benjamin understood the hesitation in her voice. He wasn't sure what she had been through, what her life had truly been like before Leo, but he could feel the weight of it in every word she spoke. The past had shaped her, molded her into someone who kept her guard up, who held her heart close, unwilling to let anyone near enough to hurt her again. But for reasons he couldn't explain, Benjamin didn't feel like an outsider here. Sitting in this room with her, in the place that had been her refuge, he felt like part of something. Maybe it was because, despite everything, they were both searching for something that they hadn't even realized they were missing. "Ellie?" he began carefully, unsure of how to proceed. "I don't expect you to trust me overnight. But I want you to know that I'm not here to take anything from you. I'm here because this house means something to you, and that matters to me." She looked up at him then, her eyes dark with uncertainty. But there was something else in them, too. A flicker of hope, perhaps, or maybe just a crack in the armor she had so carefully built around herself. Benjamin could see her fighting with herself, weighing his words against her own fears, her own reservations. "I don't know how to believe that yet," she said softly, her voice tinged with sadness. "I've trusted people before, Benjamin, and I've learned the hard way that trust doesn't always come back to you the way you want it to." The vulnerability in her voice hit him harder than he expected. There was pain there, real, raw pain, and for a brief moment he wished he could take it all away. He wasn't sure how to fix it. He wasn't even sure it could be fixed. But he knew that, for reasons he couldn't explain, he wanted to try. "I'm not asking for everything," he said, his voice steady but earnest. "But I'd like to be part of this, of what you're building. I can't change the past, Ellie. But maybe we can build something together, starting with this house." Ellie looked at him for a long time, her gaze unreadable. She didn't say anything for several moments, and Benjamin found himself holding his breath, unsure of what would come next. Finally she spoke, her words quiet but filled with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know if I can let you in. But I'm willing to try, if you're patient with me." The admission caught him off guard. He had expected more resistance, more hesitation, more walls to climb. But here she was, offering him a fragile piece of herself, a tentative trust. And in that moment, Benjamin realized how much he wanted to prove to her that it was worth it, that he was worth it. "I can be patient," he said softly, meeting her gaze. "More than you'll ever know." Ellie gave him a small nod, her eyes softening just a fraction. And for the first time since he had arrived, Benjamin felt a small spark of hope flicker within him. It was fragile, like the first flicker of a flame in the dark. But it was enough. Leo, oblivious to the tension between the adults, clapped his hands and looked up at them with wide eyes. "Play?" he asked, his voice high and eager. Ellie chuckled softly, the sound light and genuine, and reached out to ruffle her son's hair. "Of course, sweetheart. But let's give Mr. Cole a moment to breathe, okay?" Benjamin laughed, the sound easier now, more natural. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving Ellie's face. "I think I could use a little bit of playtime," he said, surprising himself with the truth of the statement. For the first time in a long while, he felt present, not just physically, but emotionally. Ellie smiled, her expression warmer now, more open. And though they had both come to this place with walls in place, they were slowly, quietly, finding their way through them. Maybe it wouldn't be easy, maybe it would take time. But for the first time, Benjamin believed it might be worth it. The days that followed Benjamin's admission to Ellie felt different. The air between them, which had once been thick with hesitation and unspoken fears, now carried a subtle warmth, a tentative trust that was slowly taking root. They spoke more openly, though always carefully, as if they were both testing the waters of something they weren't entirely sure was real. Benjamin's visits to the mansion became a regular part of his routine. He spent hours walking through the rooms with Ellie, discussing plans for the house, though the renovations were often secondary to their growing connection. With every conversation, Benjamin learned a little more about her, her stubbornness, her wit, her passion for the house and everything it represented. But there were still parts of her she kept hidden, tucked away behind walls she had built long ago. He didn't mind. He understood the need for space, for time. He wasn't about to rush her. But every now and then, during a quiet moment when Leo was napping or playing outside. Benjamin would catch Ellie looking at him in a way that made his chest tighten. It wasn't distrust, not exactly. It was something else, something deeper, more vulnerable. A look that spoke of battles fought and scars still healing. One afternoon, as they sat in the sunroom, surrounded by plants that Ellie had carefully nurtured, the quiet was broken by the sound of a car pulling up outside. Benjamin glanced out the window, his eyes narrowing as a sleek black car came to a stop at the front gate. He didn't recognize it, but there was something about the way it parked, the way it sat there like a looming shadow, that set his nerves on edge. Ellie stiffened beside him, her body language suddenly guarded. She had been absent-mindedly trimming a rosebush when the car arrived, but now her hand was frozen mid-motion, her fingers gripping the shears a little too tightly. Her eyes flicked to the window, and Benjamin could see the shift in her expression. Something closed off, something defensive. "That's my ex," Ellie said, her voice tight, almost strangled. Benjamin's heart skipped a beat. He turned to her, his expression softening with concern. "Do you want me to leave?" Ellie didn't answer right away. She just stared at the car, her lips pressed into a thin line. Benjamin could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she fought to keep her emotions in check. "No," she finally said, her voice steady but with a trace of fear beneath it. "I don't want you to leave, but I need to handle this." Benjamin nodded, understanding that this was something she had to face on her own. Still, a knot formed in his stomach as he watched Ellie rise to her feet and walk toward the door. There was something about the way she moved, the way she braced herself, that made him feel like an outsider in a world that had been closed off to him for so long. It wasn't just the ex. It was the past that Ellie carried with her, the kind of history that shaped her decisions and fears, the walls she built to protect herself and Leo. "Do you want me to stay?" Benjamin asked, his voice low. Ellie glanced back at him, her eyes softening just for a moment before hardening again. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "But it's not about you, Benjamin. It's about him." Benjamin could feel the weight of her words, the subtle shift in her emotions. He knew she was trying to protect him from whatever was about to happen, trying to keep him from getting caught in the mess of her past. But he also knew that the walls she had built around her were fragile, and if he was going to be a part of her life, he needed to understand them, to understand her. "Okay," he said quietly, watching her walk toward the door. "I'll be here if you need me." Ellie paused, her hand resting on the doorknob. "Thank you," she whispered, almost too softly for him to hear. The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving Benjamin alone in the sunroom, his mind racing with questions. Who was this man who had the power to make Ellie go rigid with tension? What had he done to her, to make her this way? And why, despite everything she had been through, did Ellie still carry a thread of attachment to him? Benjamin knew this wasn't going to be easy. He'd been drawn to Ellie from the moment they met, intrigued by her strength and vulnerability, by the way she seemed to be both fiercely independent and secretly yearning for something more. But he could see now, more than ever, that the road ahead wasn't just about restoring a house. It was about breaking down the walls Ellie had built around her heart, helping her heal from the past she was still running from. He stared out the window, watching the car parked in the driveway, waiting for Ellie's confrontation to end. He felt helpless, like an outsider watching a private battle that wasn't his to fight, but still feeling the weight of it pressing down on him. It wasn't long before the door opened again, and Ellie returned, her expression unreadable. She didn't meet his gaze immediately, instead walking to the kitchen and placing the shears on the counter with a sharp clink. "You're back," Benjamin said carefully, standing up from his chair. "How did it go?" Ellie exhaled a shaky breath, then looked up at him, her eyes bright with a mixture of anger and something softer, something vulnerable. "It went exactly as I expected," she said, her voice steady but laced with bitterness. "He wants back in, Benjamin. He wants to take Leo from me." Benjamin's blood ran cold at the words. He had expected something difficult, but this was more than he could have imagined. He stepped closer, his voice filled with quiet anger. "He can't do that, Ellie. He doesn't have any right to your son." Ellie shook her head, a sad smile tugging at her lips. "It's not that simple," she said, her eyes meeting his at last. "He's still Leo's father, and no matter what I feel about him, the courts will give him a chance." Benjamin didn't know what to say. He wanted to promise her that everything would be okay, but he knew those kinds of promises meant nothing when it came to matters of the heart and the law. Ellie had fought so hard to create a life for herself and Leo, and now, to have that threatened by the very man who had hurt her seemed too cruel to be real. But he couldn't leave it like this. He couldn't stand by and watch her suffer in silence, especially when it was clear how much she had already given up for the sake of her son. "I won't let him hurt you," Benjamin said firmly, the words spilling out before he could stop them. "I won't let him take Leo." Ellie looked at him, her expression unreadable, before she nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I don't know how to fight this, Benjamin," she whispered, her voice breaking just a little. "But I'm glad you're here, for whatever comes next." And in that moment, Benjamin knew that whatever happened, whatever battles lay ahead, he wouldn't let Ellie face them alone. The days that followed felt like a delicate dance. Benjamin had returned to the mansion several times, each visit carrying a weight he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't the house that weighed on him. It was Ellie. Her walls, once so impenetrable, were beginning to crack, but with each step forward, they seemed to shift in ways he couldn't always predict. And with every passing day, the feeling between them grew more complicated. They'd shared more quiet moments since that night, the night she had allowed herself to show him just a sliver of vulnerability. It was a fragile thing, trust. Benjamin knew that. And yet, it felt as if it were slipping through his fingers, no matter how hard he tried to hold on to it. Today, however, something was different. He had arrived early, hoping to spend some time with Ellie before the workmen arrived to begin the initial inspections on the mansion. It had been a slow morning, the clouds hanging low and heavy, threatening rain but never quite delivering. Ellie had been busy with Leo, though he had caught her alone for a brief moment before she disappeared into the back of the house. "Where's Leo?" he asked, standing in the open doorway to the kitchen, where Ellie was stacking plates into the cupboard. "He's outside, playing," she answered without looking up, her voice a little tight, a little distant. "He loves being out there. There's something about the garden. Even in the middle of the mess, he finds peace." Benjamin watched her for a long moment, the soft lines of her face illuminated by the warm morning light. She looked tired, but there was something else there, an elegance to the way she moved, a grace that hadn't been dulled by the hardships of her life. "Ellie," he said, stepping closer. His voice was quieter than usual, his words deliberate. He could sense the unease in her posture, the way she straightened slightly as if bracing herself for something. She finally looked up, her eyes locking with his. There was a flicker of surprise in them, but it was quickly masked by that guarded expression he had come to recognize. "What is it?" she asked, her tone more neutral than he expected. I wanted to ask you something," he said, hesitating, the words feeling heavier now that they were out in the open. "Do you ever think about moving on, starting over somewhere else?" Ellie's brows furrowed slightly, and she set the plate down with more force than necessary. "Starting over? You mean just leave everything behind? The house? Leo's life here? You really think that's possible? Her response hit him like a punch to the gut. The defensiveness in her voice stung, but it also made him realize how deeply she was tied to this place, how much she needed it, not just as a home, but as a symbol of survival, of endurance. No, he said quickly, his hands raised in an effort to calm her. That's not what I meant. What I meant was, does the past ever weigh on you? Do you ever think about leaving it behind? The words came out before he could stop them, too raw, too open. Ellie's gaze shifted toward the window, as if trying to find an answer in the cloudy sky. I don't know, she said, her voice softer now. I can't afford to think like that. I don't have the luxury of looking back. I have Leo, this house. It's all we have left. I've already lost so much. I can't lose this too. Benjamin stood there in silence, the weight of her words settling in between them. There was so much pain in them, so much grief, held in the spaces she refused to share. He knew she had been hurt, but he didn't fully understand the depth of it. He hadn't known what it meant to carry something for so long that it became part of your very soul, part of the reason you kept going. I'm not asking you to leave it behind, Benjamin said, his voice earnest. I just want you to know that whatever you decide, you don't have to do it alone. She looked at him then, her eyes narrowed slightly, as if searching for something in his face. You don't know what it's like, she murmured, the words so quiet he barely heard them. But Benjamin did know in his own way. He'd spent so much of his life closing himself off from anything that could hurt him, from any emotion that threatened to break through his carefully constructed barriers. He had avoided the very thing Ellie was speaking of, connection. He had built a fortress of wealth and control to keep the world at bay, but now, with Ellie, with her son, that fortress didn't feel so impenetrable. It felt hollow. I know, he said gently, but I want to understand. I want to be here, Ellie, whatever that means. For a long time she didn't answer. Instead, she walked to the window, her gaze distant as she looked out at the garden where Leo was playing. The tension between them hummed in the air, the unspoken words thick with the possibility of something neither one of them had fully acknowledged. Benjamin stepped closer, close enough now that he could hear her breathing, shallow and quick. He reached out, his hand hovering just an inch from her arm, unsure if he was crossing a line. Ellie flinched slightly, but then she turned, her gaze locking with his, and for a split second, Benjamin thought he saw something in her eyes, a flicker of the same need he felt. It was there, just below the surface in the way she looked at him. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, there was a sharp knock at the door, pulling both of them out of the moment. Benjamin exhaled, frustrated by the interruption, but Ellie seemed to visibly deflate. She stepped back, her walls instantly going up again, the distance between them suddenly miles wide. I'll get it, she said briskly, walking toward the door with a forced composure that made Benjamin's heart ache. As she opened it, Benjamin's thoughts spun. The space between them felt too vast to cross in one moment, but he couldn't help feeling that it was only a matter of time before something between them finally gave. And when it did, he wasn't sure if it would be love or something else entirely. But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going anywhere. The knock at the door had shattered the fragile moment between them. Ellie had quickly retreated into herself, her walls going back up as if they had never been down. Benjamin stood in the kitchen, his heart heavy in his chest, listening as she spoke briefly to the person on the other side. She had changed, he could tell. The warmth in her eyes when she had looked at him moments ago was gone, replaced by the coolness he had grown used to. Ellie's voice was polite but distant as she answered the door. Benjamin could only make out the low murmur of her words. but he could tell by her tone that the visitor wasn't someone she had been expecting. He was about to walk over when Ellie appeared in the doorway again, a slight frown on her face. "It's my brother," she said, her expression tight. "He needs to talk to me about something. I'll be right back." Benjamin nodded, though a knot twisted in his stomach. He hadn't known Ellie had a brother. He had assumed she was alone in this, that the house and Leo were all she had. But now he realized how little he actually knew about her life, about the family she had left behind when she had come here. "Of course," he said quietly, his voice betraying none of the frustration that had been building in him since their last exchange. He could sense that whatever was happening, it wasn't something she was comfortable with. And yet, there was a part of him, a selfish part, that wished she would just stay. Stay here, stay with him, stay in this fragile space they had started to create. Ellie's footsteps echoed in the hallway, followed by the door closing softly behind her. Benjamin sat in the kitchen, his hands resting on the cool surface of the table, the weight of his thoughts pulling him deeper into his own head. He didn't want to feel like an outsider in her life, but that was exactly how he felt, like someone on the edges, never quite in the circle. She had made it clear she wasn't ready for more, but the connection between them was undeniable, no matter how much she tried to shut it out. He had to find a way through the walls she had built. But how? It was well past noon when Ellie returned, her face more guarded than when she had left. She didn't look at him right away. Instead, she walked into the kitchen, closing the door behind her with a quiet sigh. Benjamin stood, leaning against the counter, watching her as she moved about the room. He could tell she was unsettled, her movements too sharp, too deliberate. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice softer now, careful not to push her further away. Ellie paused in the middle of opening a cupboard, her back to him. "Yeah, fine," she said quickly, but there was a tightness in her voice, a note of something unspoken that hung in the air between them. She turned, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just family stuff, nothing to worry about." Benjamin nodded, though he knew she was lying. There was something more, something she wasn't telling him. He wanted to push her, to demand she open up, but he knew better. Pushing her wouldn't help. It never helped. Instead, he leaned in, his voice low and sincere. "You don't have to hide it from me, Ellie. Whatever it is, you can talk to me." She looked at him then, really looked at him, as if she were weighing something heavy inside. For a moment their gazes locked, the distance between them shrinking, only to be replaced by a quiet tension. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again, shaking her head slightly. "I'm not ready for this, Benjamin," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm not ready to drag anyone else into this. Not again." Benjamin's chest tightened at the vulnerability in her words. He had seen her strength, her resolve, but now he saw the cracks in her armor, the fear that had been there all along. Fear of trust, fear of dependence, fear of opening herself up to someone who might just leave. "You don't have to do it alone," he said, his voice steady but firm. "I'm not going anywhere, Ellie. I won't leave you like that." Her eyes softened, but she still didn't allow herself to be swayed. "You don't know what it's like," she replied, the words more like a plea than a statement. "You don't know how easy it is to lose everything, to lose yourself, to lose your son." Benjamin wanted to say something, wanted to reach her, but all the words seemed inadequate. He wasn't sure what had happened to her, what had shaped her, but it was clear now that the walls she had built around herself were not just out of caution. They were born from deep, painful experiences that still haunted her. "I can't change your past, Ellie," Benjamin said softly. "But I can be here now. I can show you that not everything is about loss, Some things are worth fighting for. She stood still for a long moment, her back straight, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. Benjamin didn't move, didn't speak, just let the silence stretch between them, a fragile truce neither one of them was willing to break. Finally, Ellie turned to face him fully, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "I don't know if I can trust you, Benjamin. I don't know if I can trust anyone right now." Benjamin took a step toward her, but stopped himself just shy of reaching out. "You don't have to trust me all at once," he said quietly. "Just let me in, even if it's only a little bit at a time. Let me show you I'm not like the others." Ellie's gaze dropped to the floor, as though the weight of his words was too much to bear. She swallowed hard, and when she looked up at him again, there was something different in her eyes. Not fully soft, not fully trusting, but a crack in the armor just wide enough for him to slip through. "Okay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Okay, Benjamin, I'll let you in, but just be patient with me." Benjamin nodded slowly, relief flooding through him, though he knew this was just the beginning. There was still so much to be done, so much for both of them to confront, to navigate. But for the first time, he felt like they were on the same path, if only for a moment. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The following weeks passed in a strange, unspoken rhythm between Benjamin and Ellie. The tension that had hung between them like a storm cloud slowly began to dissipate, though neither one of them fully let their guard down. They settled into a quiet routine, each day revealing more about the other, sometimes in gentle ways, other times in sudden bursts of emotion that neither was prepared for. Benjamin found himself drawn to the mansion in a way that was no longer about business. He still worked on the renovations, overseeing the crew and coordinating the necessary changes, but now it was about more than just turning a profit. Ellie had made it clear that this house was her life, her heart, and though she was still cautious, she began to open up to him in small, unexpected ways. One afternoon, as Benjamin stood in the overgrown garden near the back of the house, a thought crossed his mind. He hadn't seen Ellie's brother again, though he knew their conversation had been tense. Something about that visit had lingered in Ellie's mood, and Benjamin had wondered if it had something to do with her reluctance to truly let him in. He had to admit that, despite everything, he was starting to feel more at home here than he had in years. The world he had built for himself, fast-paced, detached, and controlled, was starting to feel like a distant memory. In its place, something warmer, slower, more real, was emerging. As he thought about this, he heard the faint sound of laughter. It was Leo, playing in the garden, his tiny voice carrying through the open window. Benjamin smiled, watching as Ellie knelt beside her son, showing him how to plant a few flowers in the soil. The sight of them together, the warmth between mother and child, reminded him of everything he had never had: a family, a home, the quiet joy of simple moments. Ellie's voice caught his attention as she spoke to Leo, her words full of softness and love. He felt an unfamiliar ache in his chest, the kind that made him long for something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't just admiration for Ellie anymore, though that had been the starting point. It was something deeper, something that had been growing between them, even without either of them realizing it. Benjamin took a step closer to the window, watching them for a moment longer. Ellie was more than just a woman he had come to help restore a house. She was someone who had weathered storms, someone who carried the weight of the world on her shoulders but still found room to laugh with her son. And that, Benjamin realized, was why he had to be careful. Because in getting closer to her, he was beginning to want things he hadn't prepared for. He wanted to be part of this family, part of her life. But there was still so much he didn't understand about her, so much she hadn't shared, and as much as he wanted to push her to open up, he knew she wasn't ready. and he couldn't force that on her. With a soft sigh, Benjamin turned away from the window, making his way out of the room. He could feel his phone buzzing in his pocket, but he didn't check it immediately. There were still a few hours of daylight left, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't want to be distracted by work. He wanted to be present, to figure out how to bridge the gap between them, to find a way to show Ellie that he wasn't just another man who would leave. As he stepped out onto the back porch, he spotted Ellie standing by the garden, her hands on her hips, watching Leo as he tried to gently water the plants, splashing more water on himself than the flowers. "You might want to aim that a little lower," Benjamin called out, his voice light, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Ellie turned, her eyes brightening as they landed on him. For a moment she looked surprised to see him, but then the smile on her face softened, her usual wariness giving way to something more genuine. "I think the flowers are going to drown," she replied with a playful tone, nodding toward Leo, who was now gleefully splashing water everywhere. Benjamin leaned against the railing, crossing his arms. "Maybe he's giving them a bath. They look like they could use one." Ellie chuckled, and the sound was like a balm to his soul, soothing something that had been restless inside him for days. There was still so much she kept hidden, but in moments like these, when the laughter bubbled up between them, Benjamin felt like maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. "Do you need help with that?" he asked, gesturing toward the garden. Ellie raised an eyebrow, as if considering the offer. "Help? You've never done any gardening, have you?" Benjamin shrugged. "Can't say I have, but I'm a quick learner." She gave him a skeptical look, but the smile on her face never quite faded. "All right, but don't blame me if you end up covered in dirt. And we'll have to start with something small. Leo's a tough teacher." "Small sounds good," Benjamin agreed, his smile widening as he walked toward her. "Just don't expect a green thumb anytime soon." They spent the next hour working side by side in the garden, Leo's giggles echoing in the background as he ran around, pretending to water the flowers. Ellie showed Benjamin how to carefully plant a few bulbs, explaining the patience and care it took to help something grow. It wasn't much, just a few plants, a few flowers, but in that moment, it felt like the world was slowing down, like they had found a way to share something simple, something real. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the garden, Ellie turned to Benjamin, wiping her hands on the side of her jeans. "You're not bad at this," she said, a little out of breath from the work but still smiling. Benjamin grinned, wiping his own hands on his shirt. "I'll take that as a compliment." They stood there for a moment, the air between them comfortable, no longer filled with tension but with the quiet understanding of two people beginning to navigate the edges of something new. Benjamin knew they were only at the beginning of whatever this was, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like it was something worth investing in. And just as he thought about what to say next, Leo came running toward them, his little face lit up with excitement. "Look, Mommy, I did it! I watered the flowers!" Leo exclaimed, his hands outstretched as if presenting a masterpiece. Ellie crouched down to his level, her face lighting up with pride. "You did a great job, sweetheart," she said, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. Benjamin watched them for a moment, feeling something shift deep within him. In that moment, watching Ellie with her son, he realized that the life he had been leading, fast, solitary, constantly focused on the next deal, wasn't enough anymore. He wanted this. He wanted them. But he also knew there was a lot he still had to understand, a lot he had yet to learn, and maybe, just maybe, this was the place to start. Benjamin hadn't meant for it to happen, but as the days stretched into weeks, he found himself falling for Ellie. It wasn't just her beauty, though that was undeniable, or her strength, which was something he admired more than he had words for. It was the way she cared for Leo, the way she made the house feel alive again, even in its brokenness. It was the quiet moments, the gentle smiles, the soft touch when their hands brushed in passing. It was the way she had let him in, just a little at a time. But even as their bond deepened, Benjamin knew there was still a distance between them, one that neither of them had fully addressed. Ellie had let him into her life, into her home, but she had kept her past tightly sealed away. He could feel it in the way she spoke about her family, in the way she hesitated when he asked her about her brother. There were things she was holding on to, things she wasn't ready to share. Today was one of those rare moments when the house was quieter than usual. Leo had gone to the small park down the street with the neighbor's son, and Ellie had taken the opportunity to retreat into the back room to work on her painting, a hobby she'd mentioned in passing but never fully explained. Benjamin had taken to spending his afternoons walking around the property, overseeing the renovations, thinking about the future, and about what it all meant. As he walked toward the back of the house, passing through the garden they had worked on together, he stopped when he saw the door to the small study slightly ajar. Ellie was inside, sitting at the desk, her head bent over a stack of papers. He could tell by the way her shoulders tensed that she hadn't heard him approach. He leaned against the doorframe, his eyes lingering on her for a moment before he spoke. "Need some company?" Ellie jumped slightly at the sound of his voice, her body stiffening for a split second before she turned, giving him a small, apologetic smile. "I didn't hear you coming," she said, her voice a little too tight. "I'm just sorting through some things." Benjamin stepped inside, his gaze sweeping over the scattered papers and notebooks on the desk. Some of the pages were filled with sketches of the mansion, designs for the renovation, but others were filled with handwritten notes that appeared to be far more personal. His curiosity flickered, but he didn't press. Instead, he walked over to the desk, leaning slightly on the edge, his eyes meeting hers. "You've been doing this a lot lately," he said softly, referring to the sketches, to the plans for the house. "You've been really focused on the house. It's like it's all you've got left sometimes." Ellie didn't look up immediately. She pushed a strand of hair behind her ear, but her hands were shaking ever so slightly as she folded a page of notes. "Maybe I do focus on it too much," she murmured, almost to herself. "Maybe it's the only thing that's still mine. Maybe it's the only thing that hasn't let me down." Benjamin's chest tightened at the words. He knew she was speaking about more than just the house. It was clear now that there was something deeper behind her guarded exterior, something she had yet to reveal. He didn't want to push her, not again, but he couldn't help but feel that if she trusted him with this, with her story, maybe, just maybe, he could understand her better. "You don't have to carry all of this alone," he said quietly. "Whatever it is that's weighing you down, I'm here." Ellie's eyes flickered to his for just a moment before she looked away, biting her lip. She took a deep breath and then slowly turned toward him, her hands clasped together in her lap. For the first time in weeks, she seemed small, vulnerable. She seemed like the person she had been before the walls went up, before the defenses hardened. "I didn't ask for this life, Benjamin," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I didn't choose to be the person I am now, to have a child and live in a broken house. I didn't choose to leave everything behind just to survive. But I did. And the things I've done, the choices I've made, they've changed me." Her words hung in the air, and Benjamin felt a shiver pass through him. There was so much he didn't know about her, so much that she had never shared. He took a step closer, his heart pounding a little harder now, unsure whether he was ready to hear what she might say next. "I had a different life once," she continued, her voice faltering just slightly. "A life with someone who promised me the world, a man who seemed perfect, until I realized that his love was conditional. He didn't love me. He loved the idea of me. He wanted me to be what he wanted, not who I was. And when I had Leo, when I realized I couldn't stay in that life anymore, I ran. I ran from everything. From him, from the life I thought I wanted, from the person I had been. Benjamin's breath caught in his throat. He had suspected that there was more to Ellie's story, that her guardedness came from a place of pain, but hearing it, hearing the vulnerability in her voice, cut through him like a blade. She had been running, not just from a person, but from everything she had once believed in. "I thought leaving would make it easier," she whispered, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "But it didn't. It didn't make anything easier. And now I have Leo to protect, and I'm so afraid of making the same mistake again, of trusting someone who will hurt me." Benjamin felt his heart break for her. He wanted to pull her close, to tell her that it wasn't too late, that she didn't have to be afraid. But he also knew that healing wasn't something that could happen overnight. It was something that would take time, patience, trust, and perhaps even a little bit of grace. He reached out slowly, his hand brushing against hers, tentative but firm. "You don't have to be afraid anymore, Ellie," he said quietly. "I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to help you rebuild. Not just the house, but everything. But I can't do that if you don't let me in." She looked at him then, really looked at him, her eyes searching his face for any hint of deception. For a long moment there was silence between them, the air thick with the weight of her words, her fears, and her hopes. And then slowly, Ellie exhaled, her shoulders sagging with a quiet resignation. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered, her voice raw with emotion. "I don't know if I can trust again, but maybe we can try. Maybe we can take it one step at a time." Benjamin's chest tightened with a mix of relief and something else, something deeper. "One step at a time," he echoed, his voice steady. "That's all I'm asking." The weeks following their conversation felt like a delicate shift, a slow uncoiling of years of tightly wound tension. Benjamin noticed it in the way Ellie looked at him now. There was still wariness in her eyes, but it wasn't the cold, defensive kind he had seen before. Instead, it was more of a tentative hope, a willingness to let him into the quiet spaces of her world. It was slow, painstaking progress, but it was progress all the same. Benjamin found himself returning to the mansion each day with a sense of purpose that wasn't just about the property. Yes, the renovations continued, and the plans for the house were slowly taking shape. But it was Ellie that occupied his thoughts. The way she moved through the rooms, her quiet grace, the tenderness with which she cared for Leo. He wasn't sure when it had happened, when the business deal had turned into something far more personal, but it didn't matter now. He was in it, all in, and he was ready to prove to her that he wasn't going anywhere. But there was still something elusive about her. Despite their progress, there were moments when she withdrew again, her walls rising higher than before, leaving Benjamin feeling like an outsider once more. It was the silence between them that unnerved him. He knew her past had shaped her, but he wasn't sure just how much she was still hiding, still protecting herself from. It was a Thursday afternoon when the next turning point came. Benjamin had come to the house earlier than usual, thinking to catch up on some work before Ellie and Leo returned. The house was quiet, its old bones creaking in the wind, but there was something different in the air. The renovations were nearing completion in the main part of the house, and Ellie had mentioned she was going to the town's small market to pick up a few things for dinner. He had offered to join her, but she'd politely declined, something in her demeanor suggesting she wanted space, even if just for a few hours. He was halfway through reviewing the plans for the new kitchen when he heard the sound of footsteps approaching. Expecting Ellie, he looked up, but the person standing in the doorway was not her. It was a man, tall with broad shoulders and a rugged look that Benjamin immediately recognized. The man was holding a briefcase, his expression tight and serious. "Benjamin Cole?" the man asked, his voice deep and commanding. Benjamin stood, his eyes narrowing slightly. "That's me. And you are?" The man stepped forward, his eyes scanning the room before landing on Benjamin. "James Hayes. I'm a family lawyer representing Ellie's late father's estate. We need to talk." Benjamin felt a sudden shift in the room, a jolt of tension that made his chest tighten. The mention of Ellie's father caught him off guard, and he took a slow breath, steadying himself. "Is something wrong?" he asked, keeping his voice calm, despite the growing unease in his gut. Hayes didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced around the room, as if weighing how much he should say. "I've been in contact with Ellie a few times over the past year. We've been sorting out some family matters, and I need her to sign some documents in order to finalize everything." Benjamin's curiosity piqued. "What kind of documents?" The lawyer hesitated, clearly reluctant to go into detail, but finally spoke. "It's about the estate, Ellie's inheritance, her father's assets. There's some legal red tape that needs to be cleared up." Benjamin's mind raced. Ellie's father. She had never mentioned much about him. He knew she had left her life behind, but the details were scarce. From the way Hayes was speaking, it sounded like Ellie's past wasn't just filled with pain from her ex-husband. There were other ghosts, other unresolved issues, tied to her family. "I'm sure Ellie will want to speak with you about this," Benjamin said carefully, though a part of him already knew that Ellie wouldn't want to be involved in any of this, especially not now. Hayes nodded, his gaze shifting to the side as if something had crossed his mind. "I don't mean to intrude. I understand this might be difficult for her, but the fact is, her father's estate has some financial implications, and it's important she takes care of it soon. Otherwise, certain things will be out of her control." Benjamin felt a rush of protectiveness, even though he knew he had no right to interfere. "I'll let her know when she returns," he said, the words sharp, though he was careful not to make any assumptions. "But Ellie's been through a lot. I'm not sure she's ready to revisit anything related to her family just yet." Hayes gave him a long, appraising look, his jaw tightening. "I understand. But time is of the essence. The documents need to be signed, and if Ellie wants to claim what's hers, she'll need to act quickly. Her father's estate is tied up in a series of trusts, and there are other family members who are anxious to see things resolved." At the mention of other family members, a strange knot twisted in Benjamin's stomach. "What other family members?" he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. Hayes didn't answer right away. Instead, he set the briefcase down on the desk with a heavy thud. "I'll leave these with you. When Ellie's ready, she can sign them, but I need her to act soon. There's pressure from the other side." Benjamin watched as the lawyer walked toward the door, then paused to glance back at him. "Tell Ellie I'll be in touch," he said, his voice tinged with an air of finality. Benjamin nodded, but his mind was already racing. Family members? What had Ellie not told him? What had she been running from? And why, after all this time, was this suddenly coming back to haunt her? As soon as the door closed behind Hayes, Benjamin walked over to the briefcase, his hands trembling slightly. He opened it, carefully scanning the documents inside. It was all legal jargon, names he didn't recognize, but there was one thing that stood out, a name he didn't expect. Robert Harrow, Ellie's father. The realization hit Benjamin like a punch to the gut. He had known that Ellie's past was complicated, but he hadn't fully grasped how deeply it had shaped her, how the ghosts of her family were still haunting her. And now those ghosts had found their way into his life, into their fragile, slowly blooming connection. As he stood there, the weight of it all settled in. Whatever had happened to Ellie, whatever she had fled from, wasn't over yet, and if he wanted to truly be part of her life, if he wanted to be the man she could lean on, he was going to have to face these shadows head-on. Because she wasn't going to do it alone. And Benjamin wasn't going to let her. Ellie's return to the mansion that evening was quieter than usual. She entered through the back door, carrying a few bags of groceries, her movements brisk, almost robotic. Benjamin had been expecting her, he always did, but tonight there was a heaviness to her that he hadn't seen before. She hadn't spoken much since the lawyer had left, and he couldn't shake the unease that had settled in his chest. The mention of family, of Ellie's inheritance, of pressure from other family members, still rang in his mind. He'd hoped that the moment would pass, that Ellie would open up about it when she was ready, but the silence between them was starting to feel like an insurmountable wall. Benjamin stood in the kitchen, watching her for a moment. The glow from the overhead lights cast soft shadows across her face, but he could still see the exhaustion in her posture, the weight of something unsaid hanging between them. "Hey," he said, his voice breaking the quiet. "I didn't mean to pry earlier. About the lawyer, I didn't expect him to show up like that." Ellie glanced over at him, her gaze soft but distant. She set the bags on the counter with a sigh. "I know, it's just, I wasn't ready for it. I wasn't ready to think about all of that again." Benjamin stepped closer, careful not to crowd her. He wanted to give her space, but he also wanted her to know he was there, ready to listen if she was willing to talk. "You don't have to explain it all right now," he said gently. "But if you want to, I'm here." Ellie took a deep breath, her hands still lingering on the bags as if she were using them to anchor herself in the moment. "It's just a lot," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I had left all of that behind. When I left him, when I came here, I thought it was over. But it's not. The past, it's still here, still following me." Benjamin could hear the pain in her words, the crack in her voice that she usually kept hidden. He wanted to reach out, to touch her, but he knew better than to rush it. She needed to come to him in her own time, at her own pace. "I didn't think I would ever have to deal with my father's estate. After everything that happened, I thought he was gone, and that was it," Ellie continued, her words stumbling over each other. "But I guess there's always something left behind, isn't there? Some mess, some part of you that someone else controls. I wasn't prepared for this. For him to still have a hold on me, even after everything." Benjamin didn't say anything at first, allowing her the space to continue. He could feel the weight of her words, the rawness in them. It was clear now that Ellie had been holding on to far more than she had let on. Her past wasn't just painful. It was suffocating. "Ellie," he began, his voice low and steady, "you don't have to do this alone. I know you've carried everything by yourself for a long time, but that doesn't mean you have to keep carrying it like this." She shook her head, but her eyes softened slightly. "You don't understand, Benjamin. This isn't just about my father or his estate. This is about me, about who I was and who I became after everything fell apart. I can't just turn it off. I can't just walk away from it." Benjamin stepped closer, lowering his voice to match the quiet intensity of the moment. "No, but you don't have to do it all at once. You don't have to fix everything in one go. You don't have to be alone in this. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Ellie's eyes fluttered shut for a moment, her breath catching in her throat as she let the words sink in. She looked at him, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Benjamin saw something different in her eyes. A flicker of hope, mixed with disbelief, as if she couldn't quite believe what he was saying. "I don't know how to let go of all this," Ellie whispered, the vulnerability in her voice making Benjamin's heart ache. How do you just let go of the past? How do you let go of something that's been a part of you for so long? Benjamin didn't have all the answers. He wasn't sure anyone did. But he knew one thing for sure. Ellie didn't have to carry this burden alone. He didn't have all the solutions. But he could be here, he could listen, he could support her. "I don't think you have to let it all go, Ellie," he said quietly, his voice filled with sincerity. "Not all at once, anyway. But you don't have to keep letting it control you. You have the power to decide what you want to hold on to and what you're ready to leave behind." Her eyes searched his face, and for a brief moment, Benjamin saw the walls that had always separated them soften, just enough for him to see the woman beneath the armor. "I don't know if I'm ready to do that," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "But I want to try. I want to trust you, Benjamin. But it's hard." Benjamin's heart surged at her words, but he held himself in check, not wanting to rush her. He knew how hard it was for her to trust, to let go of the past. "Then we'll take it slow," he said softly, his voice steady. "One step at a time, whenever you're ready." Ellie nodded, the faintest trace of a smile appearing on her lips. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was a promise, a small victory. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Benjamin allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could navigate this together, one step at a time. As they stood there, the weight of everything between them slowly lifting, Benjamin felt a sense of peace he hadn't realized he was missing. Ellie might not be ready to let go of everything, but for the first time she was willing to try, and that, he realized, was the first real step toward healing. And he would be there, every step of the way. The next few days were filled with a subtle, uneasy calm. Benjamin and Ellie continued their work together, though there was a shift between them, a sense of something unspoken simmering beneath the surface. Ellie had let him in, but the cracks in her facade, the history she had carefully locked away, were starting to show, and Benjamin could sense the weight of everything she had been holding back. Her trust in him was growing, but so were the shadows of the past, and he wasn't sure how far he could reach before they consumed her. He found himself waiting, wondering if Ellie would finally let him in more completely, if she would trust him with the truth of everything that had happened before, the things that had shaped her, the ghosts that still haunted her every decision. But as much as he wanted to know, he knew he couldn't push her. She would share it when she was ready, or not at all, but there was a part of him, a part he couldn't deny, that feared the latter. It was late on a Sunday afternoon when the tension finally broke. Ellie had asked him to join her and Leo at the park down the street. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a walk, a chance for Leo to burn off some energy. But for Benjamin, it felt like a small invitation into the life Ellie was so reluctant to share. He'd agreed without hesitation, knowing that if this was what she needed, he would be there. As they strolled through the park, the leaves rustling softly in the breeze, Benjamin found himself stealing glances at Ellie, watching her as she carefully kept pace with Leo, who was darting around, laughing as he tried to catch the wind. There was a beauty in this moment, in the simplicity of it all, but there was something heavy about Ellie's silence, something that still held her back. Finally, as they stopped by a bench to watch Leo play, Ellie sat down beside him, her body language closed, her arms crossed in front of her, as if she were still keeping some distance between them. "I don't want to talk about it," Ellie said, her voice tight, barely above a whisper. Benjamin's heart clenched at the words. He knew she had been struggling, knew she was still carrying something too painful to face, but hearing her say it, hearing her admit it, made the ache inside him even sharper. He wanted to tell her it was okay, that she didn't have to explain anything to him if she wasn't ready, but something in her eyes told him this was different. She wasn't just avoiding the conversation. She was pushing him away. "I'm not asking you to," he said quietly, his voice soft but steady. "But you don't have to do this alone, Ellie. Whatever it is, you don't have to carry it by yourself." She shook her head, her eyes flicking toward Leo, who was now chasing after a kite, his little legs moving in frantic excitement. "You don't understand. This isn't something you can fix, Benjamin. I can't just move on from it. I can't just leave the past behind." Benjamin shifted, turning slightly to face her, his expression earnest. "I'm not trying to fix you. I'm just here. I'm not going anywhere. But I can't help if you don't let me in." Ellie's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment Benjamin thought she might cry. But she quickly blinked back the tears, swallowing them down with a sharp breath. "You don't know the whole story. I've been running from it for so long, I don't even know how to stop. I don't know how to be here, in this moment, with you, without thinking about everything I've left behind." Benjamin reached out, his hand resting gently on hers, feeling the tension in her skin. "Then let me help you, Ellie. Let me help you carry it. I can't take away the past, but we can walk through it together." For a long moment, Ellie didn't respond. She stared out at the park, her lips pressed tightly together, as though she were struggling to find the right words. Benjamin stayed quiet, letting her think, letting her process. He wasn't going to rush her. He couldn't. This was her fight, her burden to carry. But he was ready to stand beside her, whatever that meant. Finally she spoke, her voice barely audible over the noise of the park. "I thought I was protecting Leo by running away. I thought if I just left, if I just took him and came here, everything would be different. But I've realized that no matter where I go, the past is still with me. It's still in my head. I still hear his voice, I still feel his grip on my life. And every time I start to feel safe, it comes crashing back." Benjamin's heart ached for her. The pain in her voice, the admission that she hadn't been able to escape what she had been through. It was a wound that hadn't healed, and he knew it wasn't something he could fix with a few kind words. But he also knew that healing had to start somewhere, and maybe, just maybe, this was the first step. "It's not your fault, Ellie," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't do anything wrong. You're not responsible for someone else's actions. You can't carry the weight of his choices, too. Not anymore." Ellie finally turned to look at him, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and sadness. "I don't know how to let go of that," she whispered. "I don't know how to stop blaming myself for what happened, for everything that went wrong." Benjamin squeezed her hand, his heart swelling with a mixture of compassion and protectiveness. "You don't have to do it alone. I'm not asking you to forget. I'm not asking you to change who you are. But I am asking you to let me in. Let me help you carry it." Ellie's shoulders sagged as she let out a long, shaky breath. "I don't know if I'm ready for that." Benjamin smiled gently, not pushing her, not rushing her. "Whenever you are. I'm here, and I'll be here for as long as you need me." For the first time in what felt like forever, Ellie's lips parted in a faint, uncertain smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was a step, a small step toward healing, toward something they could build together. And as they sat there, watching Leo run across the park, Benjamin felt a quiet peace settle in his chest. They weren't there yet, not by a long shot, but they were one step closer. And for now, that was enough. The next few days passed in a haze of uncertainty. Ellie seemed quieter than usual, the weight of their conversation hanging between them like a fragile thread. Benjamin tried to give her space, but the silence between them was becoming too loud. Every time he caught her looking at him, he saw something flicker in her eyes, something that both drew him in and kept him at arm's length. He couldn't blame her. The wounds she carried were deep, and though she had begun to let him in, there was still so much more that she wasn't ready to share. Benjamin had always been a man who prided himself on control, on managing every aspect of his life. But with Ellie, he was learning just how little control he actually had. One evening, after dinner, they sat in the living room, the soft glow of the fireplace casting shadows on the walls. Leo had gone to bed early, his small body tired from a day of running and playing in the yard. The house, quiet now, seemed to echo with the unspoken words that lingered between Benjamin and Ellie. He could feel it, the distance, the divide that Ellie was still holding on to. She hadn't completely closed herself off, but Benjamin couldn't help but feel like he was standing just outside of her world, peering in but never quite invited in. He looked over at her, sitting by the fire, her hands curled around a warm mug of tea. Her gaze was distant, lost in the crackling fire. The flickering light made her look almost otherworldly, her face softened by the shadows. "Ellie," he said, his voice softer than he intended, but it was enough to draw her attention. She looked up, startled, but quickly masked her surprise with a small smile. "What is it?" "I've been thinking," Benjamin said, shifting in his seat to face her more fully. "About the lawyer, about everything you've been carrying. I know you're not ready to talk about it all, and I'm not going to push, but I need you to know something. I'm not just here for the house, I'm here for you, for whatever you need." Ellie's gaze softened, but she shook her head slightly, as though she couldn't let herself believe it. "I don't know what you mean by that, Benjamin. You've helped with the house, with Leo, but you're not responsible for me, for my life." Benjamin let out a breath, his frustration mounting but tempered by his patience. "I'm not trying to be responsible for you, Ellie. I'm not trying to take over your life. But if you need someone, if you need help with anything, I'm here. And I mean that. I mean that." Her eyes searched his face for a moment, like she was trying to gauge his sincerity. Benjamin didn't look away. He held her gaze, trying to show her through his eyes what words couldn't quite convey. "I don't know how to need someone," Ellie said quietly, the words barely above a whisper. "I've spent so long taking care of things on my own, doing things my way, that I don't know what it feels like to trust anyone else with any part of it." Benjamin felt his heart break for her, the weight of her words sinking deep. The loneliness that had become so familiar to her, so embedded in her being, was something he had only begun to understand. "I'm not asking you to trust me all at once," he said gently. "I'm not going anywhere, Ellie, but I want to be here for you, for Leo. I want to show you that you don't have to carry all of this alone." She blinked, her eyes moistening with unshed tears, but she quickly wiped them away, looking down at her hands. Benjamin could see the battle raging within her, the push and pull of wanting to let go, and the instinct to protect herself from the pain of being vulnerable. "I don't know how to stop carrying it," she said, her voice strained. "I don't know how to let go of all the guilt, all the anger. It's been a part of me for so long." Benjamin reached across the space between them, his fingers brushing against hers. She didn't pull away, but she didn't quite meet his gaze either. "You don't have to let go of everything," Benjamin said softly. "Not all at once. But you don't have to carry it alone either." Ellie swallowed hard, and Benjamin saw the muscles in her jaw tighten. Her breathing was shallow, like she was trying to hold something back. She closed her eyes briefly, as though searching for the right words, before finally looking up at him. "I don't know if I'm ready to let anyone in. Not after everything," she whispered. "But maybe I'm tired of doing it all alone." Benjamin's heart swelled with a mixture of relief and longing. "You don't have to be ready. I'm here. Whenever you need me. I'm not going anywhere, Ellie." The words hung in the air between them, thick with meaning. Ellie finally exhaled, her shoulders slumping slightly as if the weight of the world had just shifted, even if just a little. She didn't smile, not yet. But there was a softness in her expression now, something she hadn't shown before. "I don't know what I'm doing, Benjamin," she said quietly, the vulnerability in her voice unmistakable. "I don't know what any of this is, but I want to try. I want to see where this can go. With you, with us." Benjamin smiled, a small but genuine smile, and nodded. "One step at a time, Ellie. One step at a time." She took a slow breath, letting the words settle between them, and for the first time Benjamin believed it. They weren't just talking about the house, about renovations or plans for the future. They were talking about them, about the potential to build something together, something real. Leo's small voice calling from the hallway broke the silence. "Mommy, can I have a snack?" Ellie's face softened at the sound, and she rose, moving toward the door. But before she stepped away, she looked back at Benjamin, her eyes filled with something new, something tentative but hopeful. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion, "for being here." Benjamin didn't say anything in reply. He didn't need to. The way she looked at him, the way she said it, was all he needed. It was a step forward, a thread that had finally connected them in a way that went beyond the house, beyond the walls they had both built. It was the beginning of something more. And for the first time in a long while, Benjamin felt the warmth of possibility settle into his chest. The following week felt like both a breath of fresh air and a tightening of the threads that bound Benjamin and Ellie together. They had taken the first steps into a space of mutual understanding, but with each step forward, a part of Benjamin feared that Ellie would retreat again, that the walls she had worked so hard to build around her heart would rise up once more. But for now, it was enough. She had opened up in a way she hadn't before, and though she was still cautious, there was a flicker of something, hope, that he hadn't seen in her eyes since they first met. They had spent the day at the house, working together on final touches. It wasn't glamorous, just tidying up rooms, making sure the contractor's work was up to standard. But it felt good to be doing something, side by side. There was a comfort in their silence as they moved through the house, the kind of silence that was filled with understanding, not tension. After dinner, Ellie had settled on the couch with Leo, her son curled up against her. Benjamin had gone to his office to catch up on some emails, but as the evening wore on, he found his mind drifting back to her. He hadn't meant for this to happen, hadn't expected to become so deeply entangled in her life, in her past. But with every passing day, it felt like more of his heart had become tied to hers. And yet even now, there were things she wasn't telling him, things that she wasn't ready to share. He needed to know, but he also needed to respect the space she was giving him, the slow, fragile trust she had begun to build. His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. Marcus. Benjamin sighed, rubbing a hand over his face as he answered. "Marcus, what's up?" "Not much," Marcus replied, his tone light, though Benjamin could hear the underlying urgency. "But we need to talk. There's something you need to know." Benjamin straightened in his chair, sensing the shift in his friend's voice. "What is it?" There was a pause on the other end. "The house, the mansion. It's got a title issue. It's not as clean as we thought." Benjamin's heart skipped a beat. The mansion had already been a significant investment, but if there were legal issues, if the ownership wasn't clear, it could be a major setback. "Explain," Benjamin said, his voice tighter now. "The deed isn't as straightforward as it seemed," Marcus continued. "There's a lien on the property, a claim from a previous creditor. It's been tied up in court for years, and it's never been cleared. You might be looking at some serious legal battles before you can move forward with the sale or the renovations." Benjamin's stomach turned. The mansion had been Ellie's family home, and she had made it clear that she was invested in restoring it, not selling it. But now, the house, the one thing that had connected them, the one place where she could find solace, was in danger of being torn apart by something neither of them could control. "Are you sure about this?" Benjamin asked, his voice low. "I'm sure," Marcus replied. "I've already started looking into it. But I needed to give you a heads up. If this thing goes to court, it could drag on for months. It could even cost you more than you're willing to lose." Benjamin's mind raced, his thoughts flickering between Ellie and the mess that was now growing in front of him. This wasn't just about a house anymore. It was about Ellie's past. It was about the future they were beginning to build, and whether that future could survive the weight of everything she had left behind. "Thanks for letting me know," Benjamin said, his voice steady but strained. "I'll figure it out. Keep me posted." After ending the call, he sat there for a long moment, staring at the blank screen of his phone. A part of him wanted to rush to Ellie, to tell her everything and fix it, to protect her from whatever storm was coming. But another part of him knew better. She had already been through so much. He couldn't just lay this at her feet, not yet. Not when she was still working through her own demons. But how could he protect her if he didn't tell her? How could he expect to be the man she needed if he kept hiding the truth? He stood abruptly, running a hand through his hair. His heart was heavy with a mix of emotions, frustration, fear, and something deeper. He didn't know what he was doing anymore, didn't know how to fix the pieces of both their lives that were starting to unravel in front of him. But one thing was clear. Ellie deserved the truth. When he walked into the living room, Ellie looked up from her book, her eyes scanning his face as if searching for something. She was holding Leo in her lap, the little boy half asleep against her, but her expression was full of quiet concern. Benjamin hesitated for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. He had always been a man who made decisions, who fixed problems. But this was different. He wasn't just protecting a business deal. He was protecting her. Her past, her future. Their future. "Ellie," he started, his voice a little rougher than he intended. "We need to talk." She raised an eyebrow, her gaze steady. "What is it?" He took a deep breath. "It's about the house. There's something I need to tell you." Her expression faltered, just for a second before she steadied herself. "What's going on?" Her voice was calm, but there was a quiet tension in it now. Benjamin swallowed hard. "There's a legal issue with the property, a lien on the deed. I don't know how long it's been there, but it's going to cause problems. We might have to fight in court to clear it up." Ellie stared at him, her eyes wide. Her fingers tightened around Leo, but she didn't speak for a long moment. When she did, her voice was barely above a whisper. "What does that mean for us? For the house? For everything?" Benjamin felt the weight of her question, the weight of everything he hadn't yet said, and the crushing realization that he wasn't sure he had an answer. "I don't know," he said, his voice heavy with uncertainty. "But I'll fix it, Ellie. I'll do whatever it takes." She looked at him, the flicker of something fragile in her eyes, something that made his heart ache. "We'll fix it together," she said softly. And in that moment, Benjamin realized that, no matter what came next, they were already in this together. The house, the past, the future, everything. They would face it together, or they would drown trying. The rain started falling softly the morning after the meeting with the lawyer. It wasn't a violent storm, just a gentle reminder of the storm they had been weathering together. Benjamin sat in the small office at the mansion, surrounded by paperwork and legal documents that had been piling up for weeks. The weight of it was suffocating. The lien, the creditors, the court dates. They were all becoming too much to ignore. But through it all, Ellie was by his side. The once closed-off woman who had been afraid of trusting anyone, even herself, was now leaning into him, letting him help her carry the weight. He had tried to keep this fight from her for as long as he could. He had wanted to protect her from it. But in the end, he knew that the only way forward, whether they won the legal battle or not, was together. And that was what Ellie had given him. The chance to truly be there for her. To be the man she could lean on, not for the house or the money, but for herself. For the pieces of her that she had kept hidden for so long. Benjamin sat back in his chair, letting his fingers slide through his hair in frustration. It had been a long few days of conference calls, meetings, and back and forth with Marcus, who had been instrumental in securing legal help. But it wasn't just about money anymore. This was about Ellie's history, her family, and the life they were building together. There was a knock on the door. "Come in," he said, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. Ellie stepped into the room, her figure framed by the doorway. She had a softness in her eyes today, something Benjamin hadn't seen in a while. She looked different, lighter, though he knew the weight of everything still hung over them. "How's it going?" she asked, her voice low and steady. Benjamin looked up at her, his heart swelling with affection. She had been the one who had pushed him to keep going. She had been the one to remind him that their future wasn't just about this house. It was about them, together. And somehow she had convinced him that he didn't have to face everything alone. They had built something stronger than he'd ever imagined, and that realization made everything worth it. "It's moving," he said, forcing a smile. "Marcus is pushing for a settlement. We should know in a few days whether we're going to court or if we can get this resolved quietly. Either way, we'll make it work." Ellie smiled, but there was something else in her gaze, something that made Benjamin pause. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice hesitant, but there was a finality in it that caught his attention. "Maybe it's time to let go." Benjamin's chest tightened. "Let go? Of the house?" Ellie nodded slowly, her eyes not leaving his. "The house, the past, everything. I've been holding on to so much for so long, Benjamin. It's suffocating me. I can't keep living like this. I've been running from my own choices, my own mistakes. But I don't want to run anymore." The weight of her words hung in the air, and for a moment Benjamin didn't know what to say. Everything he had wanted, everything he had hoped for, was right in front of him. But Ellie was right. She had been holding on to the house not just for her family, but for the ghosts that still lingered in her heart. "I think it's time to let go of what's holding us back," Ellie continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "We've built a life here, Benjamin, and I'm ready to step forward, with you, not with the past, not with something that keeps me trapped." Benjamin stood slowly, crossing the room to her. He could see it now, the transformation in her. Ellie was no longer the woman clinging to a house, to a legacy, to a past she couldn't control. She was becoming the woman who was ready to embrace her future, and he wanted nothing more than to be there beside her. "I'm proud of you," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I know how hard this is. Letting go is never easy. But you're not alone, Ellie. You never will be." She stepped closer to him, her eyes searching his face, and for the first time Benjamin saw the full depth of her vulnerability and her strength. She reached out, placing her hand over his heart, and he felt the weight of everything they had been through together in that one simple gesture. "I'm ready to build something with you, Benjamin," she said, her voice steady. "Not just a house, but a life, a real life. With you." Benjamin took a deep breath, feeling like he had just stepped off the edge of a cliff, trusting that the ground would catch him. He reached out, pulling her into his arms. We've already started, Ellie. And it's going to be everything we want it to be. Together. The moment stretched between them, a breath caught in time, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Benjamin realized something important. He had always sought control in his life, money, power, business. But it was love, this love, that had truly changed him. It had opened him up, made him realize that no amount of wealth or success could fill the emptiness he had carried for so long. It was Ellie who had shown him that there was a different way forward. And though their journey wasn't over, Benjamin was ready. He was ready to face whatever came next with her, to build the life they both deserved. Ellie stepped back slightly, looking up at him with a soft smile. "We don't need a mansion to make a life together," she said quietly. Benjamin smiled, his heart full, and for the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. "No, we don't. We just need each other." And as they stood there, surrounded by the soft hum of a world that seemed to be waiting for them, Benjamin knew one thing for sure. They had already begun to rebuild. Not just a house, but a life. Their life.